The aircraft was 41,000 feet in the air when every instrument on the flight deck stopped responding at the same time. Not one system. Not two. All of them. Captain Sarah Voss had been flying commercial jets for 11 years. She had handled engine failures, hydraulic warnings, bird strikes, and thunderstorms that turned the sky into something that looked more like a battlefield than an atmosphere. She had kept her voice calm through all of it. She had trained for all of it. But nothing in her training had ever described a moment exactly like this, sitting in a darkened cockpit at cruising altitude with 214 people behind her, watching every screen go black at once, and hearing her first officer say 3 words that no pilot ever wants to hear at 41,000 feet. I have nothing. Flight 7 from Chicago to Frankfurt had departed O'Hare at 10:47 in the evening on a Tuesday in late November. The weather at departure had been clean. The forecast over the Atlantic was manageable, some chop expected at FL 390, a pressure system sitting north of Iceland that air traffic control had already factored into the routing. The passengers had boarded without incident. The plane, a wide-body twin-engine jet with a perfect maintenance record, had pushed back from the gate without a single flag on the pre-flight checklist. Sarah had done this route dozens of times. She knew the waypoints by memory. She knew which part of the crossing usually got rough and which part almost always stayed smooth. She knew the rhythm of the overnight transatlantic flight, the long quiet hours when most passengers slept and the flight deck felt like its own sealed world, somewhere between the stars and the ocean, belonging to neither. Her first officer that night was a man named Daniel Okafor. He was 34 years old, careful, methodical, the kind of pilot who double-checked things that most people only checked once. They had flown together 6 times before. They worked well together. There was no drama between them, no competition, no tension. Just 2 professionals doing a job they both took seriously. 3 hours and 20 minutes into the flight, somewhere over the middle of the North Atlantic, everything changed. The first thing that went was the primary flight display. Sarah watched the screen in front of her simply go dark, not glitch, not flicker, not throw an error code. Just gone. A clean, complete absence of information. Before she could say anything, the secondary display followed it. Then the navigation system. Then the standby instruments. Then the radios. I have nothing, Daniel said. Sarah did not panic. She had spent 11 years training herself not to panic, and in this moment that training held. But she felt something else, a quality of stillness that she had never felt before in a cockpit. It was not calm. It was something closer to the feeling you get in the half-second between stepping off a curb and realizing there is a car coming. The world had not ended yet. But something had broken that was supposed to be unbreakable. She reached for the standby radio. Nothing. She reached for the backup battery controls. Nothing. She tried the interphone to reach the cabin crew. Nothing. Okay, she said. We are going to work this problem. Those 5 words would later be repeated by investigators, by journalists, by people who wrote about what happened that night. Not because they were dramatic. But because of how she said them, the same tone, the same weight, the same steadiness that she would have used to say them in a simulator exercise on a Tuesday morning with coffee still warm in the cup holder. What Sarah Voss did not tell Daniel in that moment, and what she had not told anyone at the airline for the past 3 years, was that she had been here before. Not in a darkened cockpit. Not over the Atlantic. But in a place that felt exactly like this, a place where everything had been stripped away, where the systems that were supposed to protect you had failed completely, and where the only thing left was what you yourself could do. 3 years earlier, Sarah had not been flying commercial routes. She had been doing something else entirely. She had spent 8 years as a military pilot before she transitioned to civilian aviation. She had flown close air support missions, long-range reconnaissance, and a category of operations that did not appear in any public record and that she had never discussed with anyone outside the people who had been there. She had accumulated a reputation in those years, not loudly, not through self-promotion, but through the specific, quiet, undeniable way that reputations form in environments where performance is the only currency that matters. Her call sign had been Ghost 7. She had chosen it herself, early in her career, as a small private joke. She had grown up being told that she was too quiet, too contained, too hard to read. So she had leaned into it. Ghost. The thing that is there but that you cannot quite see. The thing that moves through spaces without disturbing them. In the last operational year before she left military aviation, Ghost 7 had been involved in an incident that she never spoke about publicly. She had been flying a mission, the details of which remained classified, when her aircraft had experienced a catastrophic systems failure at altitude. Not a simulation. Not a training scenario. The real thing. She had brought that aircraft back. The investigation afterward had concluded that the recovery was, in the words of the review board, outside the established parameters of what this platform is designed to survive. The board had been trying to give her a compliment. She had not experienced it as one. She had experienced it as a reminder that the established parameters had never been designed with her in mind. She left the military 6 months after that. Not because of the incident. But because of what happened after the incident, a series of decisions made by people who had not been in that aircraft, about what her future in that organization should look like, that made clear to her that the people making those decisions did not understand the value of what they had. That is the diplomatic way to describe it. The accurate way to describe it is that the board had made a recommendation for a specific assignment, and someone above the board had overridden it for reasons that Sarah had been told were structural and unrelated to performance, but that everyone in the room understood to mean something else entirely. She had signed her separation papers with the same steady hands she used to sign everything else. She had walked out of the building. She had found a commercial airline that was looking for experienced pilots, and she had started over. She had never talked about Ghost 7 in her civilian career. She had never mentioned the incident. She had never used the call sign. She had filed it away in the same place she filed everything that had happened in those years, not forgotten, not buried, just set aside, the way you set aside a tool that you no longer need but cannot quite bring yourself to throw away. Over the North Atlantic, with no instruments and no communications and 214 lives depending on what she did next, Sarah Voss opened that drawer. She did not think about it consciously. It was not a decision she made. It was more like a shift in posture, the way an athlete who has been warming up suddenly stops warming up and starts competing. Something in her that had been in standby mode for 3 years came back online. "Give me the backup oxygen system status," she said. "I can't read it," Daniel said. "Nothing is reading." Manual check. The physical gauge. Behind the left panel. Daniel moved. He found it. He read her the number. "We have pressure," she said. "The aircraft is intact. We are not losing structural integrity. This is an electrical failure. Possibly a catastrophic bus failure. The aircraft will continue to fly." She said this not only for Daniel's benefit but for her own, not because she needed the reassurance, but because in a crisis, saying true things out loud is a way of anchoring yourself to reality when reality is trying to become something formless and terrifying. She began working through the physical checklist from memory. Not the abbreviated version. The full version, the one that pilots are trained on and then never expected to need completely because the systems are supposed to catch things long before you get to the bottom of it. She worked calmly. She worked systematically. She worked with the kind of focus that had been described, years ago in a performance review that she had never shown anyone, as unnerving in the best possible sense. She is the only pilot I have evaluated who becomes more precise under pressure rather than less. 15 minutes into the failure, something came back. Not everything. Not the primary systems. But the emergency radio, the one that runs on its own isolated power supply, the one that is supposed to be the last thing to fail and the first thing to come back, suddenly produced a single tone. Sarah picked up the handset. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is Delta Heavy on guard. We are declaring an emergency at approximately 40 degrees north, 42 degrees west. We have experienced a total electrical failure. We are estimating current altitude at flight level 370. We have 214 souls on board. We are in controlled flight. We request any available assistance. She released the button and waited. The silence that followed was about 4 seconds long. In normal communication, 4 seconds is nothing. In a declared emergency over the open ocean, 4 seconds is long enough to wonder if anyone heard you, long enough to start calculating what you do if no one answers. Then a voice came back. It was military. The brevity, the cadence, the way it cut through the static, Sarah recognized the format immediately. Delta Heavy, this is Falcon Flight. We are 40 miles to your north. We have your mayday. Say again your souls on board and confirm you are in controlled flight. Confirmed controlled flight. 214 souls. We have emergency radio only. Request escort and relay to ATC. Another short pause. Then a different voice came on, not the same pilot, someone else, someone who had evidently taken over the frequency. And this voice said something that was not in any standard emergency procedure. Delta Heavy, confirm your pilot in command. Sarah frowned slightly. That was not a normal question in this context. In a Mayday relay situation, the military escort did not ask for the identity of the pilot. They asked for the nature of the emergency, the souls on board, the fuel state, the destination. Not the name of the pilot. She answered anyway. Pilot in command is Captain Sarah Voss, Delta Airlines. Another pause. Longer this time. When the voice came back, there was something different in it. Not unprofessional. Nothing had broken from protocol. But something in the texture of the transmission had changed. Captain Voss. Understood. Falcon Flight is turning to escort position now. We will relay your situation to Gander. You are not alone out here. What Sarah could not see, at that moment, was what was happening inside the two F-22s that made up Falcon Flight. The lead aircraft was flown by Major James Rourke, a 12-year veteran of the 1st Fighter Wing with a record that included 3 overseas deployments and a commendation for an intercept operation he had conducted over the Barents Sea that was still partially classified. The wingman was Captain Luis Cervantes, who had been flying with Rourke for 2 years and who had, in those 2 years, never seen his flight lead do what he was about to do. When the first Mayday call came in, Rourke had responded with the standard procedures: turn toward the contact, establish relay communications, begin the escort protocol. Clean, professional, by the book. Then the commercial pilot had given her name. Rourke had not said anything for a moment. Then he had keyed his interplane radio, the channel between his aircraft and Cervantes, and said 3 words. Ghost 7. Confirm. Cervantes had not understood the reference. He would understand it later, after everything was over and Rourke had explained it to him in a hangar in the Azores while they both drank coffee that had gone cold without either of them noticing. But in the moment, he had just heard his flight lead say 3 words in a tone that he had never heard from Rourke before, not afraid, not uncertain, but carrying something that Cervantes would later describe as, the sound of someone realizing that the person they are flying toward is someone they owe a debt to. James Rourke had been a junior officer 3 years ago when the incident that Sarah never talked about had taken place. He had not been there. He had not been in her unit. But he had been at the debrief, a joint debrief that had included several squadrons because the operational theater had overlapped, and he had heard what she had done. He had heard it from people who had been in the air that night, people who did not use the word legendary easily and who had used it anyway. Ghost 7 had brought an aircraft back from outside the parameters of what it was supposed to survive. And then Ghost 7 had been given a desk job and quietly pushed toward the door, and everyone in the room at that debrief had known it, and nobody had said anything about it out loud because that is the thing about injustice in closed systems, it is often clearest to the people who are not in a position to do anything about it. Now Ghost 7 was over the Atlantic with no instruments and 200 people behind her, and James Rourke was turning his aircraft to put it 40 feet off her left wing, and there was nothing he could do to fix the injustice of 3 years ago, but there was something he could do right now, and he was going to do it perfectly. The next 2 hours were the longest of Sarah's life. Not because she was afraid, she was not, or not in the way that fear usually manifests. She was focused in a way that left no room for fear. Fear requires a part of your mind to be idle, to be running scenarios that are not useful. Sarah's mind was not idle. Every part of it was working. She had re-established partial power to 2 of the primary instruments, not through any system recovery, but through a manual rerouting that the aircraft's designers had included as a last resort option and that most pilots knew existed but that most pilots had never actually needed to use. The procedure required you to physically access a panel behind the captain's seat, remove a cover, and move 3 circuit breakers in a specific sequence that was printed in the emergency checklist in letters so small that most people would need reading glasses to see them in normal conditions, let alone in a darkened cockpit. Sarah did not need reading glasses. She had memorized that section of the checklist 3 years ago while she was going through her initial type rating training, not because anyone had told her to memorize it, but because she had been sitting with the manual late one night and had looked at that page and thought, that is the kind of thing you want to know by heart before you need it. She moved the breakers. 2 instruments came back. Altitude and airspeed. Not navigation. Not communications except for the emergency radio. But altitude and airspeed, which meant that she knew how high she was and how fast she was going, which meant that she was flying the airplane and not just riding in it. Falcon lead, we have partial instrument recovery, she transmitted. Altitude and airspeed. We are at flight level 365 and holding. Speed is stable. Request you continue escort. Copy that, Delta Heavy. We are with you. Gander is aware. There is a runway at Lodge's Field on Terceira Island. Distance approximately 400 nautical miles from your current position. We can escort you there. Sarah did the math in her head. 400 nautical miles at their current speed and with their current fuel state. Manageable. The bigger concern was the approach. Landing a wide-body commercial jet with partial instruments and no ILS guidance in the middle of the night was not straightforward. Lodge's was a military airfield that also handled commercial diversions. She had never landed there. She had a general sense of the approach procedures but not the specifics. Falcon lead, can you get us the Lodge's approach plates? We have lost our navigation database. There was a brief pause. Then Rourke's voice, steady. We can talk you through the approach. We have the plates. We are not going anywhere. She believed him. In the cabin behind Sarah and Daniel, a flight attendant named Maya Torres was doing the most difficult part of her job. Maya had been a flight attendant for 9 years. She had been through turbulence, diversions, medical emergencies, a passenger who had tried to open the door at altitude, and a flight where both galley ovens had caught fire 20 minutes into a 6-hour leg. She knew how to manage a cabin under stress. But this was different, because in all those previous situations, she had been able to communicate with the flight deck. She had been able to pick up the interphone, hear the captain's voice, get information. Tonight, the interphone was dead. She had no idea what had happened. The lights in the cabin were still on, the passenger lighting ran on a separate emergency system, but everything else that connected the cabin to the cockpit was gone. She had gone forward and knocked on the flight deck door and received no answer, and she had made the decision not to try to enter because she did not want to distract the pilots from whatever they were managing, and because in the absence of information, the most dangerous thing you can do is make assumptions about what is needed. So she had gone back to the cabin and she had done what flight attendants are actually trained to do in situations that fall outside the standard procedures. She had managed the information environment. She had moved through the cabin quietly, speaking to passengers in a low, direct voice, telling them only what was true, that the aircraft was flying normally, that the crew was working a technical issue, that they would have more information shortly. She had not pretended that everything was fine. She had not performed a false calm that the passengers would see through immediately. She had acknowledged that something was happening and had communicated through her own demeanor, unhurried, present, steady, that whatever was happening was being handled. 40 rows of passengers watched her moving through the cabin and took their cues from her. Some of them were frightened. Some of them were asleep and remained asleep. Some of them watched with the wide eyes of people who understand that they are in a situation they cannot control and have decided to trust the people who can. One passenger, a retired airline pilot sitting in 24C who had recognized the quality of the darkness in the cockpit area as something more than a routine issue, caught Maya's eye as she passed his row and gave her a small nod. She returned it. No words were necessary. They both understood what was happening, and they both understood the terms under which it was going to be resolved. 3 hours and 40 minutes after the initial failure, at 2:17 in the morning local time, Flight 7 touched down at Lodges Field on the island of Terceira in the Azores. The landing was clean. Runway 33. 5-degree glide slope. Manual approach, no automation, Sarah flying entirely on the 2 instruments she had recovered and the voice of James Rourke reading her altitude and distance from 300 feet above and to her left, his F-22 position so that its landing lights illuminated the threshold markings as she descended. She set the main gear down at the touchdown zone with 3 feet of centerline deviation. By commercial standards, that is a normal landing. By the standards of what she had just done, no ILS, partial instruments, a runway she had never seen in an aircraft she was not supposed to be able to land manually at this level of system degradation, it was something else. The aircraft rolled out. She stood on the brakes. It stopped. The cabin was silent for about 2 seconds. Then someone started clapping, and within 5 seconds the entire aircraft was applauding, and Maya Torres, standing at the front of the cabin, allowed herself to put one hand over her mouth for exactly 3 seconds before she straightened her back and went to work on the deplaning procedures. Sarah sat in the cockpit for a long moment after the aircraft stopped. Daniel was on the radio with the tower, the emergency radio was still functioning, and they were coordinating the gate assignment and the emergency vehicle response. Sarah let him handle it. She sat with her hands resting in her lap and she looked out at the runway lights and the darkness beyond them and the faint gray beginning of something that might, in another hour, become dawn. She was not thinking about what had just happened. She was not processing it. She was in that particular state of exhaustion that exists on the other side of extreme focus, the state where your body has finished doing the thing it was called upon to do and has not yet started explaining to you what that cost. She was thinking, for no reason she could have explained, about a conversation she had once had with an instructor during her military flight training. He had been a weathered man of few words who had, over the course of a 10-month course, said many things that she had not understood at the time and had later come to understand completely. One of the things he had said, in the middle of a debrief after a particularly difficult training scenario, was this. The best pilots I have ever known all have one thing in common. They are not the ones who are never afraid. They are the ones who know what to do next. She had written it down. She still had it somewhere, on a card in a box in the back of her closet, along with other things she had kept from that time in her life. She knew what to do next. She always knew what to do next. That was the thing about her that the board had never understood, had never quantified correctly, had never been able to fit into their models of what a career was supposed to look like. There was a knock at the flight deck door. "Captain. Ground crew is ready." It was Maya's voice. "Thank you, Maya. We'll be out in a minute." She took one more breath. Then she stood up, straightened her uniform jacket, and opened the door. The 2 F-22s were parked on the military side of the field. By the time Sarah had finished with the initial emergency debrief, a process that took 40 minutes and that she handled with the same methodical precision she had applied to everything else, someone had sent word to the military side that the pilot of the diverted aircraft wanted to speak to the escort flight. James Rourke was standing on the tarmac when she came around the corner of the terminal building. He was still in his flight suit. He was a few inches taller than she had expected. She realized, been building a mental image of him from his voice, and the voice had suggested someone slightly shorter. He was about her age, maybe a year or two older, with the kind of stillness that some people carry after years of doing work that requires them to be very still. He saw her coming. He did not move toward her. He waited. She walked up to him and stopped and looked at him for a moment. "Ghost 7, he said. It was not a question. It was a statement. An acknowledgment. "That was a long time ago," she said. "Not that long." She looked at him carefully. "You were at the debrief." "I was." He paused. "I always thought, a lot of us thought, that what happened afterward was wrong. What they did with your assignment. What it turned into. It turned into this," she said simply. "So." Rourke looked at her for a moment. Then he extended his hand, and she shook it, and neither of them said anything for a few seconds because there was nothing that needed to be said. The language of what had happened tonight, what they had both been part of, the precision of his positioning, the steadiness of his voice on the radio, the way he had read her approach plate numbers without a single deviation, had already said it. "Your people okay?" he asked. "All 214, she said. He nodded. "Nice landing. Nice escort." A beat. The wind off the ocean was cold and tasted of salt. In the east, the sky had started to make good on its promise of dawn, a thin line of gray at the horizon, lightening slowly, the way the sky lightens over the water, which is without drama and without hurry. "How'd you get the partial instruments back?" he asked. "The engineers are going to want to know." Manual breaker sequence. Section 9 of the emergency checklist. Page 73. Rourke stared at her. "You had that memorized." "I had that memorized." He let out a breath that was not quite a laugh but was something in that direction. "Ghost 7, he said again, and this time there was something different in it, not just acknowledgment but something closer to the specific respect that one person with a particular kind of knowledge extends to another person with the same kind of knowledge. She did not say anything. She looked at the dawn. 2 weeks later, Sarah Voss was sitting in a conference room in Atlanta. The room was on the 14th floor of the airline's operations center, and it had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city, and the table was long and polished and had 16 people sitting around it. There were airline executives, there were investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board, there were legal representatives, there were communications officers, and there was a man at the far end of the table who had introduced himself as a senior official from the Federal Aviation Administration. Sarah had been given a chair on the left side of the table, about a third of the way down. She had brought no legal representation, a fact that had made the airline's lawyer noticeably anxious. She had brought a cup of coffee and a yellow legal pad on which she had written, in the hours before the meeting, 8 pages of notes about the failure sequence, the recovery procedures, the communication gaps with ATC, and 12 specific recommendations for changes to aircraft emergency protocols that she believed would prevent a similar situation from becoming a different kind of outcome. The meeting lasted 4 hours. When the investigation team finished presenting their technical findings on the cause of the electrical failure, a cascading bus fault that had been caused by a manufacturing defect that the maintenance process had not caught, they had turned to Sarah for her account. She gave it for 45 minutes. She used the legal pad. She did not leave anything out. She described every decision she had made and the reasoning behind each one. She described the manual breaker procedure. She described the communication with the escort flight. She described the approach to lodges. She described the landing. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. The FAA official at the end of the table looked at her over his reading glasses. "Captain Voss," he said. "I have been in aviation safety for 29 years. I have read the preliminary report on this incident." He paused. "Can I ask, where did you develop the knowledge to execute that manual breaker sequence under those conditions?" Sarah looked at him steadily. "Military aviation," she said. "What kind of military aviation?" "The kind where you learn what to do when everything fails," she said, "because everything failing is not a theoretical scenario." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned to the man next to him and said something quietly. The man wrote something down. 3 days after that meeting, Sarah received a call from the airline's chief operations officer. The airline was creating a new position, Director of Emergency Procedures Development. It was a role that had not previously existed. It would involve reviewing and updating the emergency training protocols across the airline's entire pilot training program, working with the manufacturer on maintenance checklists, and developing a series of advanced emergency procedures courses that would draw on scenarios outside the current training matrix. They wanted her to lead it. She could keep flying if she wanted. The role was designed to be compatible with an active flight schedule. Or she could step back from the line and focus on the program. Her choice entirely. She said she would think about it. She did not think about it for very long. Sarah called her sister that evening from a hotel room in Atlanta. Her sister was a pediatrician who lived in Portland and who was, in Sarah's estimation, one of approximately 4 people in the world who fully understood her. They talked about twice a month, in calls that typically lasted either 12 minutes or 2 hours with very little in between. This was a 2-hour call. Sarah told her sister everything, not just the incident itself, which her sister had already read about in the news, but the other things. The layers underneath the incident. The 3 years of filed-away history. The call sign. The conversation on the tarmac with Rourke. The meeting in the conference room. The offer. Her sister listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Sarah most valued about her. When Sarah finished, there was a pause. So you've been the most qualified person in every room, her sister said, for 3 years, and nobody in any of those rooms knew it. I didn't want them to know it. Why not? Sarah thought about this. She had thought about it before, in the years since she had left the military, and she had never found an answer that was fully satisfying. Because the record should speak for itself, she finally said. What I did before should not determine what I am allowed to do now. If I was going to be good at this job, I wanted it to be because I was good at this job. Not because of a call sign. Her sister was quiet for a moment. That's a very principled way to be invisible, she said. Sarah almost laughed. Yeah. Are you going to take the position? Yes. Good. A pause. Are you okay? Sarah looked out the hotel window at the Atlanta skyline, at the spread of lights across the dark grid of the city, at the planes descending in the distance toward Hartsfield, their landing lights like slow-moving stars coming carefully down to earth. I'm fine, she said. And for the first time in a long time, for the first time, she thought, since she had signed those separation papers and walked out of that building and started over, the word fine felt accurate. Not triumphant. Not resolved. Not healed. Those are too large. Just fine. Just okay. Just the quiet, honest sense of a person who has done the thing they were built to do, and has been seen doing it, and has found that being seen was not as dangerous as they had spent 3 years believing. 4 months later, the first cohort of pilots went through the new emergency procedures course that Sarah had designed. It was a 5-day program, conducted in full-motion simulators with scenario parameters that had been drawn from actual incident reports, not the standard library of training scenarios, but edge cases, the kind of failures that appeared in investigation reports under the heading, contributing factors, and were technically studied but rarely trained for. Total electrical failures. Cascading system faults. Communication blackouts at oceanic positions. The scenarios that existed at the intersection of extremely unlikely and not impossible, and if it happens to you, you need to know what to do. The first group was 12 senior captains from across the airline's North Atlantic fleet. They were all experienced. Several of them had been flying longer than Sarah. A few of them, she knew, had arrived at the course with the particular skepticism that experienced pilots sometimes bring to mandatory training, the quiet, controlled impatience of someone who believes they have already learned everything worth knowing. By day 2, that skepticism was gone. Not because Sarah lectured them out of it. Not because she invoked her credentials or her history. But because she put them in the simulator, put them in scenarios that exceeded their previous experience, and then sat in the debrief room afterward and walked them through what had happened and why, not with judgment, not with the distant authority of someone who had never made a mistake, but with the precision and the honesty of someone who had been exactly where they were and who had had to find her own way through. On the last day of the course, during the final debrief, one of the captains, a man named Foster who had been flying for 22 years and who had arrived on day one with the most visibly contained skepticism of the group, said something that had not been planned for and that Sarah would remember for a long time afterward. "Can I ask you something personal?" he said. "Sure," she said. "Where did you learn this?" "I don't just mean the procedures. I mean the way you think about it. The way you stay in it when everything goes sideways." Sarah looked at him for a moment. "I learned it the same way you learn everything that actually matters," she said. "By being in a situation where it was the only option." Foster nodded slowly. "The Atlantic incident," he said. "That was you." "That was me." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I remember when that came out in the reports. I read it and I thought, whoever did that, I want to know how they think." "Now you know," Sarah said. The investigation into the manufacturing defect that had caused the electrical failure on Flight 7 eventually led to a worldwide inspection program affecting more than 400 aircraft of the same type. The defect, once identified, was straightforward to fix, a grounding issue in a specific component of the electrical bus architecture that could be corrected in a maintenance bay in about 90 minutes. All 400 aircraft were inspected and, where necessary, corrected within 60 days. The pilot who had landed the aircraft without instruments became, briefly, the subject of a kind of coverage that she did not particularly welcome, the profiles, the interviews, the attempts to turn what had happened into a story about individual heroism rather than a story about what the experience revealed about training gaps and maintenance processes and the value of emergency preparedness. She gave 2 interviews. Both of them were short. Both of them redirected to the training program, to the maintenance issues, to the 12 recommendations she had submitted to the FAA in the days after the incident. She did not talk about the military. She did not talk about Ghost 7. She did not talk about the injustice of 3 years ago or the conversation on the tarmac or the way the dawn had looked coming up over the Atlantic from the runway at Lodges. Some things are not for public consumption. Some things belong to the people who were there. But there was one interview, given to an aviation trade journal rather than a general audience, where the interviewer, a woman who had clearly done her research and who asked better questions than most, said at the end, "Is there anything you want people to understand about what happened that isn't in the official reports?" Sarah thought about this for a moment. "Yes," she said. "The things that save you in emergencies are not the things you review once a year in a training module. They are the things you have learned so thoroughly that they are not learned anymore, they are just part of how you think. The moment you need them, you don't reach for them. They are already there." The interviewer wrote it down. Sarah picked up her coffee cup and looked out the window of the small conference room where the interview was being conducted. Outside, on the ramp, an aircraft was being pushed back from the gate. The tow truck moved slowly. The plane, enormous and patient, moved with it. In 3 hours, Sarah had a simulator session with the second cohort of the emergency procedures course. After that, a flight to Zurich, which she had accepted because she always flew at least twice a month and she had learned, in the years since she had left the military, that the way to stay sharp was not to think about staying sharp but simply to keep doing the thing. She had things to do. She always had things to do. She finished her coffee, thanked the interviewer, picked up her bag, and walked out of the room. 11 months after the Atlantic incident, Captain Sarah Voss received a letter from the United States Air Force. It was from the Office of the Chief of Staff. It was brief. It said that a review of certain historical personnel decisions had been conducted, that this review had identified a small number of cases in which separation decisions had not adequately reflected documented performance records, and that Captain Voss's case had been identified as one of those. The letter did not offer reinstatement. It offered something smaller and, in some ways, more precise, a formal acknowledgment that the record had not been correctly read, and a commendation, backdated, added to the permanent file, for the incident in which she had brought an aircraft back from outside the parameters of what it was supposed to survive. She read the letter twice. She set it on the kitchen table. She went to make coffee. By the time the coffee was ready, she had decided that the letter mattered. Not because she needed it, she had stopped needing it a long time ago, somewhere over the Atlantic in the dark, or maybe before that, in the moment she had moved the 3 circuit breakers in the right sequence and watched the altitude indicator come back to life. But because the record should be accurate. Because the people who came after deserved to know what had been done and who had done it. She picked up the phone and called her sister. "The Air Force sent a letter," she said. "What kind of letter?" "The kind you write when you finally read the file correctly," Sarah said. Her sister was quiet for a moment. "How do you feel?" Sarah looked out the kitchen window at the morning. The sky was clear. Somewhere up there, above the blue, above the reach of anything visible, the air was cold and thin and full of nothing but distance. "Like myself," she said.